Hi class, I hope you're doing well. This is a review for exam 2, which covers chapters 29, 30, 35, and 31, which is seedless plants, seeded plants, plant form, and fungi. So to start off with chapter 29, seedless plants. Not all of these in this photo are seedless plants, but there are a few. So we've got moss, which is considered to be seedless, and we also have ferns. And those are the only two that I can really see that are considered to be seedless plants, and so we're going to learn about those. So the origin of land plants, as you may know, there are some plants that are aquatic, but the ones that we're going to be talking about today are land plants. And so there are some challenges when they evolved out of the water onto land, and we're also going to talk about some of the traits that they had to have to be able to make that transition. But here we've learned already how to read a cladogram or a phylogenetic tree, and so you kind of see the transition of where all of our land plants came from. So they all came from an ancestral type of algae, and then they all just kind of branched off. But some of these you might be more familiar with than others. Like I know for sure you all have seen moss. So that's considered to be a seedless plant. The ferns also are seedless. So anything over here, right, is considered to be seedless, and then these have seeds, gymnosperms and angiosperms, which we will learn about in a little bit. So when plants evolved out of the water and came onto land, there are some difficulties that they had to, I guess, overcome, mainly being water loss. And so how they battled that is they now have a waxy cuticle, which I think is on the next slide, so I'll kind of wait. But another thing too is that they had the help of fungi. And so fungi, and I have it written here, mycorrhiza, that's a type of fungi that you find on the roots of a plant. And so if it wasn't, if there was no mycorrhiza, then we probably would not have successful plants that are on land. Some of the adaptations that we briefly mentioned would be that they have a waxy cuticle on the leaf and also on the outer parts of the stem. And they also have a stomata, and I have a picture of a stomata in the next slide so you can kind of look at. So this word here, desiccation, protection from desiccation means that the plant will not dry out, right? And so that's why they have the waxy cuticle and the stomata. And then they also mention here tracheids, which is for water movement, and the xylem and the phloem is really important, and we're probably going to see that 2 to 3 times within this PowerPoint, so just kind of keep your eyes peeled for that. These are some pictures of a stomata. So you'll find the stomata on the underside of a leaf, and they're just kind of like these pores, just kind of like how you have pores in your skin. This is very similar. And so this is again on the underside of the leaf, and so this is, the purpose is for gas exchange. This is where they take in CO2 and they let out oxygen. So this protects them so that they don't overextend themselves. They're not always transpiring and letting out oxygen, and also not letting out water as well. So that's pretty much the purpose of the stomata, is so they don't dry out. The life cycle of seedless plants is a little bit different, mostly because they don't have seeds, right? And most people can't even think of that plants don't have seeds. So what they have are what we call spores. And so that's the biggest difference between seeded and seedless plants. That's one of the biggest reasons, is that they don't have seeds, they have what we call spores. And they do undergo mitosis, and again we had mentioned, I think in the last exam, that mitosis and meiosis is something that you're only going to see in eukaryotic cells. You won't see it in a prokaryotic cell. And so I don't need to go too much into detail on here, but I really wanted you to see that they do use spores instead of seeds. They do also create sperm and egg. Once they are fertilized, or once the sperm fertilizes the egg, then you have what you call a zygote, which then will transition to an embryo, and then you can have more seedless plants. This word here, bryophytes, is something I do need you to remember. This is going to be probably the biggest type of seedless plants that you'll need to know about, and there's different ones that are in the next slide, we already mentioned earlier that they would not be successful if it wasn't for the help of the mycorrhiza fungi. So it's just a symbiotic relationship. The type of symbiotic relationship is mutualistic. It's a mutualistic relationship, meaning that both benefit. The fungi benefits as well as the plant. Some characteristics for bryophytes. Well, let's start off here with the types. The 3 types, and you might have seen this when you were doing your lab. There's the liverworts, the mosses, and the hornworts, and I have some pictures in a little bit for you to kind of look at. This is really important down here, is how they reproduce. They do need water, and you know what? I don't know if that was shown here. It wasn't, but okay. So where you actually find these plants, and we can actually go back to that original photo. Right, where are you going to find mosses and ferns, hornworts? You're going to find them in very humid or wet or moist environments. So again, this is kind of the earliest type of land plant, and so they couldn't travel far away from the water, and they weren't in like full sun. And one of the main reasons is because of the spores. They don't have a seed. A seed has a seed coat and it's very protective. A spore does not have that, and so it can dry out very easily. So because, let's go back to that original slide. Because they don't have a seed coat, it's just a spore, they need water for sexual reproduction. So for the sperm to actually travel, to the egg, it does need the help of water. So that's the reason why you'll only find these plants in relatively humid environments. Here's a picture of a liverwort. I just included this slide just so you can kind of see a picture of it. I've never seen these in person. Maybe you have, but I just wanted to include that picture for you so that you kind of knew what we were talking about. Mosses you have seen, so this is probably how you have seen them, but maybe you haven't seen this part of the moss, which is like the reproductive part. So if you were to zoom in on moss, and if it's in the reproductive stage, they'll kind of have these tall stalks, and then they have what they call the sporophyte part. And so in there is where the spores come out, which is really interesting. So one of the characteristics of moss is that they don't have true leaves and no vascular tissue. Vascular tissue is something that has a xylem and a phloem. A xylem is for movement of water, and the phloem is for the sugars, glucose that's made in the leaves from photosynthesis. So they don't have vascular tissue or true leaves, and that's why they're very small. These plants won't grow more than a few inches. An exception to that would be like a fern, but a fern actually does have vascular tissue. But things like mosses and the liverworts, they don't have vascular tissue, and that's why they're very, very small. They also don't have roots either. They have what we call rhizoids, and so those are not true roots. So if you ever were to kind of grab moss out of the ground and you could pull it up, you'll see like these very small, I guess kind of like modified roots, but they're not actually roots. They're called rhizoids. I also included these words here because I know that they show up in your lab, and so I wanted to kind of cover them just in case. So the Archegonia and the Antheridia. Archegonia is female and Antheridia is male. If you're familiar with flower anatomy, you would know that the anther is also the male part. So maybe that might help you a little bit, but Archegonia is female and Antheridia is the male part. And I just wanted to kind of show that in case you needed this for lab. And then it kind of talks about how it kind of goes. But okay, let's see. This is the moss. So this is what we saw in that earlier slide with the sporophyte right here. So this is what you're seeing in this slide. So very interesting. Oh, and here you can kind of see the rhizoid. So they don't go very deep like how roots actually go. They go very, very deep into the ground. These won't. These are very much close to the surface. Tracheophytes are also known as vascular plants. So these are plants that have vascular tissue, which is the xylem and the phloem. There's different types. most notably would be the ferns. Ferns is probably going to be the most popular one, seeded plants as well, and then a different type of mosses, which we call the club moss. So all of these have vascular tissue, and so they can grow taller than the other plants that we mentioned before. So again, the xylem is going to move water, and then the phloem is going to move, it says sucrose, hormones through the plant, so sugars. So xylem is going to move water, and the phloem will move the sugars. Typically, the phloem is going to move the sugars from the leaves, anywhere that the plant needs it, and it's going to be from the leaves because the leaves is where photosynthesis occurs. We mentioned this already, that vascular tissue helps these plants grow taller, and then also mentions the cuticle and the stomata is also found in land plants. Excuse me. Here are the phylums, Lycophyta and Pterophyta, and then different types of examples. We mentioned some of these earlier, but notice how these are significantly taller. It might be hard to see from these diagrams, but in comparison to a moss, a bryophyte, which would be the mosses or the liverworts or hornworts, these are significantly taller because they have that vascular tissue. And then also notably, they want you to know that ferns have several different types of species. They have 11,000 types or 11,000 species of fern. So this is going to be the plant that has the most diversity. So here they mention the stems, the roots, and the leaves. I think we know what stems and roots do, but leaves I think kind of gets left out. So we mentioned it that leaves help for photosynthesis, and so when you have a really big leaf, they kind of act like solar panels. So the bigger the leaf, the more surface area you have for photosynthesis. But also that can be a downfall if you are in a place that's really, really hot. If you have a bigger leaf, that means you're going to have more stomatas, and so you're going to have more transpiration that occurs, and so water will leave the leaf as well as oxygen, and so that's why you'll see in like deserts the leaves are much smaller, and it's for that, so that they don't transpire as much. When you have a seed is kind of like it's a game changer for plants because seeds can last a long time. You can leave a seed out for hundreds of thousands of years. They're really highly resistant. They also have food for the plant, and I think we mentioned, well, we will mention more of that in a little bit, so just kind of hold on tight. We mentioned that they're the most abundant group of seedless vascular plants, and we're talking about the ferns. So ferns are seedless. They produce spores, and so just kind of remember that. And I wanted to include this side just so that you kind of knew the difference. And I added this photo. This photo wasn't originally here. So we have the spores, and let's see, where are they? So here are the spores, right? And then so once they kind of mature into a gametophyte, which most people, I'm not sure, have seen on a fern, and so I wanted to include this photo. So this is the gametophyte part of a fern, and then so this tall part right here is going to be this, right? So the main part of the fern, and so I wanted to include, so I guess it's kind of like looking at this photo. So I wanted to include this just so that we were a little bit more familiar of how the fern looks when it's smaller and then when it actually matures. And so you kind of see the similar words here, right? You see the archegonium, the antheridium, so that's the same thing where you have a female and a male part. And again, this does need water to get that sperm to the egg to fertilize and create the zygote. Fern morphology, so this is how it looks, right? And how it kind of forms. And maybe you've kind of seen a fern, they have what they call fronds, and so they're tightly coiled and then they kind of bend outward. And so the same thing here, how they'll bend outward and then they'll look like a mature fern. So that's really unique. Some people actually cook these and eat these. I've never tried it, but I'm sure it's pretty good. We mentioned, I think, these parts already. Diploid spore, you know what, let's go over that really quickly if we're not familiar with those words. If you ever see this N and 2N, When you see N, that means haploid, and then 2N means diploid. And so you notice that the haploid phase is before fertilization, and then after fertilization is going to be diploid, meaning 2 sets. Right, so once the egg and the sperm combine, they are considered to be diploid because you have both male and female DNA. And I think that's it. So let's go ahead and move on to Chapter 30, which is seeded plants, plants that have seeds. So these are going to be plants that don't have spores, they have seeds. They're very successful plants because of the seed. We mentioned earlier they have a seed coat, and so that allows it to be, I guess, protected a lot better. It could survive harsh periods, so like extreme drought. It's not until it has its needs. It just needs a little bit of water and then it can actually germinate. But if it doesn't have that little bit of water, it won't germinate, but it's still alive. So having a seed and a seed coat has really been successful for seeded plants. And then I think we can move on to the next part. The importance of the seed coat. Let's see. Once the seed coat forms, most of the embryo's metabolic activities cease. So this is just saying that it can pause. If it's not going to germinate, it's going to wait, and it's not going to do anything to that seed. It won't deteriorate at all, and it'll be fine. And it says here, some seeds have been known to remain viable for thousands of years, which is actually really cool. These are different types of seeded plants. The ones that you might be familiar with is probably this last one. Anthophyta, also known as the angiosperms. So these are going to be plants that flower. This could be anything like an orange tree, grass, I mean anything that flowers. What flowers? Off the top of my head, I mentioned to you all a Montanaza tree. I mentioned there's the fiddlewood. I'm trying to think of RGV trees. Ebony, so anything that flowers is considered to be an angiosperm. The ones that you're not familiar with are going to be probably these two. The ginkgos there's only one species left. Like it says it here. There's only one species left, and it's being protected by, I want to say it's the Japanese culture. If you were to look up ginkgo trees, they're really pretty. They flower, I think, like a bright yellow, and the Japanese are the reasons why these haven't died out. These neophytes, I think, I've heard that they smell really bad, which is really strange. But it's kind of an ugly looking plant if you were to Google these. Cycads, a lot of people have these in their front yards and don't even know what they are. They look like palm trees, but they're actually not palm trees, and so maybe you also are one of those that have one in your front yard. Conifers are going to be things that have cones. So anything with a cone, pine trees is the most popular one. So all of these have seeds. Gymnosperms is most notably known for, let me highlight that, having naked seeds. So they have seeds, but they are naked, so they don't have that really hard protective seed coat. So they're a little more susceptible to the elements, but they're still pretty successful. They don't have flowers like angiosperms, and then let's kind of show you what we mean by naked seeds. So where is a pine cone? Okay, so here's two. So there are male and female pine cones, and you know what? I didn't include that. Let's see if we can find one really quick. 1 second. And you don't really need to know, but it's kind of better to see an actual picture. Is that okay? Guess that's okay. Male and female cones. Oh, that one okay? That's kind of better, okay. You can kind of see that a little bit. So I have a male cone and a female cone. The male cones are always going to be relatively skinny versus a female cone. So the female cone will have the seeds and the male cone will have the pollen. Right, so I have pollen bearing, so this is going to be the male, and then I'm going to have seed bearing cones, so this is going to be the female. And so they have two different cones, And so it'll, let's see, I have the pollen here, and the pollen will meet with the female, but they have a different, it's an interesting type of system that these have, because if you notice, if like the, how do we explain this? Right here, 15 months after pollination. So it will pollinate the female twice, you can kind of see that, but it's not until 15 months that it will actually continue the process. And so you don't really need to know this like step by step, but just kind of know that there are cones, and within those cones there are seeds. Pollen is in another cone, which is from the male cone. But yeah, this process is kind of an interesting process. And I think typically the reason, or the, not the reason, but the dispersal, there we go, dispersal of pollen to females is typically going to be with wind for these. So the wind will push the pollen into the female part. So this is for pine. So again, these are gymnosperms. So, just to emphasize that, gymnosperms. And gymnosperms means naked seeds. Angiosperms are flowering plants, very diverse, and we're going to learn a little bit about them. I wanted to show you this as well so you can kind of see the transition. So gymnosperms, naked seeds, and angiosperms, anything that's flowering, and it is very diverse. So these are grasses, well, this one specifically. Other monocots include things like corn, bamboo, typically things that have like really slender leaves, and also the veining is parallel versus these different ones, the dicots, there we go, that's the word, dicots or eudicots. They have broader leaves. But yeah, so you can kind of see the difference between those. When we're looking at the flower, there's some parts that we kind of need to talk about, and it's kind of also like, what is the purpose of a flower? And so that's the reproductive part. And so you may kind of know they have different, or they serve as different purposes, but for as far as reproduction, they do need a pollinator, right? And so that's why we kind of talk about why pollinators are so important, why bees are so important, flies, butterflies. And this is the reason why, because a flower really cannot pollinate itself. It has to get the pollen from the anther. So the anther is where the pollen is, that's the male part, and it has to land on the stigma, travel all the way down to the ovary, and that's how it gets pollinated. But this process cannot occur without the help of a pollinator. So what will happen is that a flower needs to attract a pollinator. And so how it does that is with the petals. The petals are brightly colored. So that's one way. Another way is through scent, that flowers smell really pretty. And so why does a pollinator even come? It's because these plants or the flowers have nectar, right? So they will come for the nectar because it's a really sweet food for them, and indirectly they will pollinate the flowers, right? They're kind of walking around on the flower. Their body will brush up on the anther, which has the pollen, and then it'll land on here. And so they've co-evolved together. Plants or flowering plants and insects have co-evolved together, and that's why we need them. We really do need bees and all of that. So kind of wanted to really emphasize that. So for them, excuse me, the main thing that I needed you to see out of this slide is this part right here that we call double fertilization. And so it's fertilized twice, and the reason is because one sperm will pollinate a zygote, which is a baby plant, and the other sperm will pollinate this to create the endosperm. And so there's two polar nuclei, and I can't see them. I guess they're right here, really, really small. So it pollinates, the sperm will fertilize, the sperm will fertilize two polar nuclei and create a zygote, which is a baby plant, and then an endosperm. And so what the endosperm is, it's the nutrition. So if you've noticed, if you put a seed in the soil, it can't photosynthesize yet, right? Photosynthesis, we said, happens on the leaves. And so seeds don't have leaves, right? So how is it that this seed is able to grow up into a plant? Where does it get the energy from? The energy comes from the endosperm. So that's the reason why it's this double fertilization process. So the endosperm will give the nutrition to the baby plant, and then the baby plant can grow up into a plant. Now it has leaves, and now it can photosynthesize and make its own food, and it's self-sufficient now. And so that's the reason why, and it's pretty interesting how that works. So let's go back here, right? Once fertilization occurs, the ovary will turn into a seed. And there's different types of seeds. You can have legumes, you can have berries, samaras, which I don't even know what this is. That's kind of interesting. And then you can have drupes. And so there's different types. Drupes are going to be things that have one seed. So this would be like peaches, mango. I guess they have examples here, right? Plums, cherries, and then you have berries over here, and then you have what we mentioned again, like the legume. So anything that has a seed pod is a legume. So here we have the Texas ebony trees that have those really big brown pods. That's considered a legume. Tamarindo, right? Tamarindo is another one. It has like a pod. So those are different types. The reason for fruit, let's kind of talk about that. What is the purpose of the fruit? And it's to for the genes to continue, right? So once an animal smells the fruit, sees the fruit, is attracted to those bright colors and the scents, it eats the food. Inside of the fruit is the seeds. Those seeds then get moved somewhere else, and so it just kind of continues the gene. So it's very interesting how that works. Okay, moving on to chapter 35, plant form. This is going to be short because we've actually kind of already covered a lot of the main things in the previous chapters. We have a picture of a plant, and so we're kind of familiar with that, right? You have the root and then what we call the shoot. So the shoot is anything above ground, and the root will be anything below ground. If you've noticed, roots are white, and that's because they don't photosynthesize. They're underground. They can't photosynthesize. And so that's why they're white, and then anything up here is actually green. And I think we have already mentioned most of this. Vascular plant consists of a root system, shoot. Yes, we're okay. This next one talks about the vascular cambium. So if you've ever cut a tree, or if you've seen a tree cut in the middle, you'll see the tree rings. And so what are those, right? Rings in the stump of a tree reveal annual patterns. So every year it will create a ring. And so that's the vascular cambium growth. Let's kind of bold that, right? And so if a stem cannot increase, that's because they're missing vascular cambium. And so this I need you to remember. And then here it kind of talks about that it depends, which is true. So like if it's a dry year, they can kind of determine that, or they can determine climate if they were to take I'm not sure what it's called, like a core sample of a tree, like a really old tree. You can take a core sample, and from there they can kind of count the rings, and you can kind of see the spaces in between the rings, and they can determine if there was a drought for several years, etc., etc. Different types of leaves. There are simple, and then there are what we call compound leaves. And so simple is just going to be like one, well actually this has a few, right? 1 leaf, 2 leaf, 3 leaf, 4 leaf, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So right, so this is 5 leaves and 4 leaves. What a compound leaf is that all of this is 1 leaf. And you know what, a really good one, let's give you an example. Is it called a mimosa? Mimosa tree. Let's see. Yeah, it's a good one. But I don't know if I can see the leaves. That's pretty good. That'll do. All right, so this is a mimosa tree, really, really pretty. But you see how all of this, this is a compound leaf, and all of this is considered to be 1 leaf. So very interesting. So those are simple and compound leaves. And it says here, compound leaves have blades that are divided into leaflets. right? So these are considered to be the leaflets. We mentioned earlier that photosynthesis happens on the leaves, and so when you think of a leaf, you should think of it as like a really big solar panel. And so this is showing you a cross section of a leaf. So like if you were to cut a leaf, this is what it would look like in the middle. These are the stomatas that we mentioned. So this is where gas exchange occurs. It takes in the CO2 and lets out the oxygen. It also lets out water. Most notably in this part, this is what we call the mesophyll. And I need you to remember this for your exam. Within the mesophyll, all of these plant cells, and you know they're plant cells, right, because of the shape, they have the big vacuole in the middle, but all of these have a lot of chloroplasts, right? And why do they have a lot of chloroplasts? Because this is where photosynthesis occurs. So again, within the mesophyll part of the leaf, you're going to have a lot of chloroplasts, and that's because that's where photosynthesis happens. This is our last chapter, chapter 31, fungi. It's not a plant, although it looks like a plant. I think a lot of people mistake fungi for plants because they look like them. They grow out of the ground. I guess the shape, I'm not so sure. Why? I'm assuming mostly because they grow out of the ground. But they're very, very different from plants. I'm not sure why they group them with plants as far as like when we do our examinations, but fungi is not a plant, right? It doesn't have, it doesn't photosynthesize, and there's also quite a few things, and we'll kind of mention them in a little bit. The different phylums of fungi, this is just to show you how diverse they are. The one that you might be most familiar with are going to be like these, right? Mushrooms, right? So mushrooms belong to the phylum Basidiomycota, and then there's all these other ones, Zygomycota, Glomeromycota, Ascomycota. Also, if you ever see this mycota, if you ever see mycota at the end of something, you should automatically know that's a fungi or a fungus. Anything with mycota. Okay. General biology of fungi. They're multicellular, but they also can be unicellular. I'm not sure why they have that, but it could be multicellular or unicellular. If it is multicellular, they have these long filaments called hyphae, and I have a picture somewhere showing it. I think it's in the next slide. And so you can have a lot of hyphae that are connected to each other, and they form what we call filaments. If you have a mass of something, that's called something else, but I really need you to remember this, the hyphae. They have long, slender filaments called hyphae, and there's, let me just go to this picture so it makes a little bit more sense. Right, so I have all of these, mycelium, which is a cluster of hyphae, and so I don't like these pictures, but it'll have to do. Well, you know what, let's look at a better picture. All right. Fungi, hyphae. All right, this will be okay. Okay, so all of these are individual cells that are put together, right? And so that's why we call them multicellular. So this is one hyphae, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? So there's all these hyphae or cells put together, and so they're different from a plant cell. They don't have chloroplasts. They also don't have things like let's see, what else? Like a big vacuole. So there are some differences, but they do have a cytoplasm. They've got a nucleus, a cell wall. They have less things, but they're not as advanced as other types of cells that we've already covered. That one's a little bit clearer, right? So we have all of these put together. Okay. Just wanted to clarify that. They have cytoplasm, and I think we mentioned before why the cytoplasm is so important. The cytoplasm is where glycolysis occurs, and so this is how they're able to create ATP, right? So they can metabolize. This is a mushroom life cycle, so not all of the fungi have a life cycle like this. This is just for Basidiomycota, which is the mushrooms, and you have these in your front yard. They tend to grow when there's a lot of water, and the reason for that is because they have spores, right? And so spores need water to be able to kind of germinate. So you'll have them kind of grow up, and then sometimes you'll even see like a tear in the middle because of rapid growth. But really, I just wanted to kind of show you their cycle. You don't really need to know this kind of word for word or anything, but just kind of look at that so you can kind of be familiar. How do they eat, right? How do they get their food? And so they are what we call saprophytic, which is not on here, but let's go ahead and add it. Saprophytic. See if we can move this kind of around. That'll work. So they're saprophytic, which means that they obtain their food by secreting digestive enzymes. They absorb the organic molecules produced by this external digestion. So what they really, they're what we call decomposers. And so when you see this word saprophytic, it's associated with decomposers. So they have a really important role in our environment because they are the ones that kind of clean up our ecosystem, right? And so we mentioned that here as well, that with bacteria, they're the decomposers of the biosphere, so they're really essential to our environment. I know some people kind of associate them with like filth, things like mold and like other, I know they can be kind of gross, but they do have their purpose and their role in the environment. We had also mentioned earlier, and I think it comes up again, it does in a little bit, some of the interactions they have with other species. When you see this word symbiosis, those are symbiotic relationships, and so there's the mutualism one, which is both benefit. There's commensalism, where one benefits and the other one is not affected. There's parasitic. Am I missing any? Okay, those are the ones that we need to mention, right? And so when you see something like a pathogen, it harms the host and also can cause a disease. Parasites cause harm to the host but do not cause disease. Commensalism, one benefits and the other one does not get harmed, and mutualistic, that they both benefit. So there are different roles that these fungi can play in our environment, and so we're going to kind of go over a few of them. A lichen is in this chapter, and it's kind of confusing as to why, because they are not necessarily a fungi, but we kind of don't know where to put them in biology, right? They're very unique. So let me show you a picture really quick so you kind of know what they are. So you may have seen them on trees. If you have like an oak tree, I'm trying to think of other trees that I mostly see them on oak trees. And so they can be like a yellow or this kind of sage color. And so they're very interesting. They're not a fungi, but they are a blend of a fungi and a cyanobacteria, most notably. So they have fungi properties and also photosynthetic properties. So when they're on like a tree, or a rock, which is really cool. So lichens actually can make soil. If you ever have an environment that has pure rock, you're bound to see lichens on rocks because they break down, they eat away at the rock, and that's basically what soil is made out of. So it's kind of interesting. They're kind of the, what are they called? Pioneer? No, not pioneer species. Let's kind of look them up. Lichens on rocks, just so you can kind of see. Primary succession, that's what I'm thinking of now that I remember. You'll see them for primary succession. So if you see them on a rock, they eat away at the rock, but they also can photosynthesize. That's how soil is created. So very interesting. But you do need to remember lichens, their purpose, their role in the environment, and very interesting. They're a blend of both, again, fungi and cyanobacteria, so both a saprophytic and photosynthetic partner. Okay. The mycorrhiza we mentioned earlier, how they have helped plants actually come onto the land and actually stay here. So they'll be on the roots, and so they help provide nutrients. Most specifically, it'll be like minerals. It'll help break down things in the soil that the plant can't break down, and then the plant is able to bring that into the root. So really cool. So it's a mutualistic relationship, meaning that both benefit, the fungi and the plant benefit. It says that you can find mycorrhiza on 90% of vascular plants, and it's known as an extension for the root system. Plants that are really, really healthy in a really healthy soil have a lot of mycorrhiza, and so we're now seeing in like farming, if they are farming every year, the soil doesn't have enough time to create healthy bacteria and healthy fungi, and so that's why we're kind of seeing the food that we eat is not as nutritious, because we're really disrupting the cycle of allowing soil to be a really healthy soil. So that's also another thing to kind of think about. We're almost done here, by the way. Some other symbiotic relationships between fungi and animals is most notably these ants and fungi. So these leafcutter ants, there we go, they hang out with the fungi. So they have domesticated fungi, and which they keep in underground gardens. So the ants provide the fungi with leaves, and the fungi are foods for the ants. So that's one mutual relationship between animals and fungi. Fungi can also be very bad. A lot of people are familiar with athlete's foot. Athlete's foot is something that is, I think it's on the, like it eats away at the skin. Another one is ringworm. I know we're familiar with that, and also nail fungus. So this is not a mutualistic relationship. Not both parties do not benefit from this. So that one I know we don't like that one. There's also yeast, which is really a really good thing that we have in as far as our food production. We use it for a lot of things. You can find yeast in bread, and that's what makes the bread rise. And it says it here, right? Yeast can ferment carbs, so it breaks down glucose into ethanol and CO2, used to make beer, wine, and bread. And so that's kind of typically what we used yeast for. And this will be our last slide. And I only wanted to include this just so that I know it's a common one that we know of. So this is also a different type of fungi. It's called zygomycota. And so this is bread mold, and so this is kind of what it looks like. And I just wanted to show you just so that you kind of know what it looks like. And so that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and feel free to review it. And again, if you're watching it on YouTube, you can put me at twice the speed and watch it multiple times, however you want to review, and good luck on your exam.